Thank you, Mike, and brothers and sisters. It's lovely to be with you again in the flesh last weekend in Singapore and here in KL this weekend. So really enjoyed the hospitality that I've been able to share with you all, and very grateful for your warmth and your care. Bring with me, of course, greetings from brothers and sisters at the Enfield Ecclesia as well. Many of whom you may know or certainly have met in the past. Well, this morning we're considering Psalm 56. It's not a daily reading, but it's probably one of, I suppose, those Psalms that's a favourite or has become a favourite of mine. I particularly love, and we'll get to it later on towards the end of the exhortation, but verse 8 is just such a beautiful verse, talking about that closeness of relationship that we can have with God. But we'll come to that a little bit later on, and we'll see a little bit of the reason for why it's important in the context of really the background to this psalm. So the psalm really comes to life when we look at the background context that it's written in. And as Brother Mike pointed out at the beginning of the reading, the superscription over the top of the psalm has it as being when the Philistines took him, David, that is, in Gath. So he was fleeing from Saul and he'd gone down to Gath. Well, what he's really done is run from a situation into a worse situation when we think about the context. And we'll walk through this in a little bit of the detail shortly. But you know, it's a situation in which his response is to circumstances that could have been, circumstances that took his life. And at any point in time, any point of decision, there typically is two ways you could go. There's two options that are placed before us. And in this case, the same thing is true. But as we'll see, the key in this decision is, who will David place his trust in? Okay, and that's the point, and that's the point really of exhortation for us this morning. It's a reflection upon, in our circumstances of life, all the things that we face, the joys, the sorrows, the troubles that we may face. There's always a point of decision for us to make. Who do we place our trust in? Now, you'll notice, and Brother Mike again in the superscription there, it speaks of this as being a miktam of David. It's a psalm. In fact, this little group of psalms, Psalm 56 through to 60, as well as Psalm 16, all have this little superscription on them. The little, if you like, it's a category sort of label. So it binds these psalms together, and it's under this banner of miktam of David. What's interesting is, miktam is a Hebrew word, but it's a little bit uncertain as to what it actually means. So when the translators were translating and putting these notations in, they didn't actually make a sort of direct translation from the Hebrew. And that's because it is a little bit uncertain as to what it's about. Often miktam psalms are referred to as teaching psalms. And the reason, or one of the main reasons for that, is in the superscription of Psalm 60, it says there again, it's a miktam of David, but it says there, miktam of David to teach. So the thought is that perhaps these are psalms which are grouped together because there's importance of message to be found within them. There's instruction, there's teaching to be taken from it. So there's psalms that are intended for our instruction, something for our learning. It's a way that, of course, the Bible presents to us events from people's lives, their decisions, their actions, and that's intended for our learning. Not just a story, not just a point of interest, but to look at that and say, well, how does that apply to my life? And this grouping of psalms is certainly along those lines. And the other thought is, and I've got a King James, so I will reference the King James this morning. It's a version that I have with me. But in the marginal references for the King James, it has a note next to miktam, and it talks about it as being a golden psalm. Okay, and you'll find the same thing, Psalm 16, in the superscription there, and in fact, probably if you go through all of the marginal references for each of these chapters, you'll find the same references made, a golden psalm, a golden psalm. Now, again, there's not necessarily anything to point to this word being associated with gold or anything like that. But the thought behind it perhaps is that these are seen as psalms with value within them. They're precious. There's value. There's things that we can take from them to learn from. And so I think we just put a sort of a conclusion over the top of that, that these are grouped together. They're under a specific category. That's so they will stand out from other psalms for a particular reason. But of course, all of the word of God is for our instruction. So it's just an interesting little point at the start. Well, I think for the next few minutes, we just really want to have a look at the background to this psalm. So to do that, we'll turn back to 1st of Samuel and chapter 21. So we know as we turn there, we've mentioned it, this is when David is on the run. He's fleeing away from Saul. In chapter 20, the end of chapter 20, we find that David has just made his goodbyes. He's said goodbye to Jonathan, and what an emotional time that was for David. And you can just imagine the confusion and the fear that would have been there. He's going from a place of what was relative safety, I suppose, to a point very quickly where he's had a javelin thrown at him. Jonathan's had a javelin thrown at him. Not as a warning, but to end his life in that point. And now he has to part from the person who, from a descriptive point of view, Jonathan was not his brother, but there's a friend that sticketh closer than a brother. And I think that verse sort of encapsulates the relationship he had with Jonathan. So now he feels alone, or pretty much alone. He's not alone, but pretty much sort of on his own. So we'll just read through the first little section of verses here, just to pick up on the context. So yes, the end of chapter 20, he's parted from Jonathan. And where does he go next? Well, it says, then David came to Nob, to Ahimelech the priest. And Ahimelech was afraid at the meeting of David, and said unto him, why art thou alone, and no man with thee? Well, wasn't quite true. There were others with him. We'll see that in a moment. And David said unto Ahimelech the priest, the king hath commanded me of business, and hath said unto me, let no man know anything of the business whereabout I send thee, and what I have commanded thee. And I have appointed my servants to such and such a place. Now, therefore, what is under thine hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread in mine hand, or what there is present. And the priest answered David and said, well, there is no common bread under mine hand, but there is hallowed bread. The young men have kept themselves, at least from women. And David answered the priest and said unto him, of a truth, women have been kept from us about these 3 days since I came out. And the vessels of the young men are holy, and the bread is in a manner common, yea, though it were sanctified this day in the vessel. So the priest gave him hallowed bread, for there was no bread there, but the showbread that was taken from before the Lord to put hot bread in the day when it was taken away. Okay, so a little bit of Old English sort of language being used there, perhaps, but we get the idea. He's fled, he's come to Ahimelech, and look at the way Ahimelech responded to his coming. It was with suspicion, wasn't it? It was out of, he was concerned. It says he feared. Why does David come alone? Like, what's going on? Something is not right. And Ahimelech picks up on that, thinking whether that's just for the fact that David had come there, and that was quite unusual, or whether he saw in David that there was some difference in his demeanor, in his, he was concerned, he was afraid himself. Perhaps it could have been all of those things, but he comes and essentially he says, we need some food. He talks there in the old King James, common bread. But the point there is there's a distinction. being made. It's not just a loaf of bread that, has been cooked up for the purpose of, consumption, keeping yourselves alive. That's the common bread, but the showbread was the only thing that was available, the hallowed bread. And as we know, the hallowed bread was the loaves of bread that were placed inside of the tabernacle. And the point of those loaves of bread, there were 12 of them. The point of those loaves, of course, was this was the works of the hands of the people of Israel. And the point was they're offering up their life, their service, their work to God. And that was the point of that showbread. Okay, so it's not just for information's sake that we're getting this, and I think we'll see this as this develops. So the first thing, though, I think that we would note here is the words of David in verse 2. He said that he was on business from the king. No, he wasn't. That's a lie. That's a lie. But you've got to think of this in the context of what is the situation. It's not an excuse to lie. God hates liars. That is clear from a biblical perspective. God doesn't like something that's not truth. But David in the situation shows his very human aspect. And I think all of us can probably understand when the pressure is on, when things are looking a little bit desperate, sometimes we might just try to help ourselves out of a situation by a little bit of not so true words. And, I say that and we all smile because it's true. It's something that we're very familiar with being humans. But that's what we note first. The second thing, though, and in the context of that showbread, the showbread was about offering service to God. Now think about what it symbolizes if you're taking that back. If you're taking that bread to consume the bread yourself, what does that say in a spiritual sense? You're taking back your service to God and you're going it alone. You're serving yourself. You're finding another way. So there's an underlying meaning you see in this. It's not just a simple handing over of bread. There's a little bit more to it. Okay, so with that in mind, we get to verse 7. And verse 7 starts here with now. And I'd circle that, I'd highlight that, because for 3 simple letters, it's a very important word in the context here. Okay, and why do I say that? Well, because verse 7, it's like we've chopped off at verse 6, inserted verse 7, and then kept going with the story that's happening from verse 8 onwards. So why does it pop in here, this little note? It's not a side note. The Bible doesn't waste words. It's important. So now, a certain man of the servants of Saul was there that day, detained before Yahweh, and his name was Doeg, and he's an Edomite, the chiefest of the herdmen that belonged to Saul. Isn't that interesting? God had said he'd have war with the Ammonites and the Moabites. Edomites are related parties. And yet here he is as a servant of Saul. Now, Saul, as we know, at this point in time, was not particularly a good example of a servant of God at this time, or by this time. But it's interesting. So it inserts this into the record here. Now, why is this important? And I think as much as I'd like to continue through the chapter here, I think it's worth us just having a look at the next chapter and just picking up the record here in verse 9. So I think there's a really important thing to pick up here. And if I forgot to mention it at the start, and I may have, I think it was on the slide, the theme for this morning is about trust. And we did make that distinction or pulled it up from the start. We have decisions to make, but the key decision in life is, who do we trust? Okay. But in that context, David, we can see, was leaning to trusting in his own way here. He's taking back the showbread. And then the next thing that we know is Doeg was there. But why is that important? And we pick it up again here, verse 9 of chapter 22. Then answered Doeg, the Edomite. Well, take a step back. what's happened is Saul has heard, of course, from Doeg that David has been with a Ahimelech here. And Saul feels like that's a betrayal. So he calls Ahimelech and his family, he calls them all up to come and see him and discuss this. But it says there in verse 9, then answered Doeg the Edomite, which was set over the servants of Saul, and said, I saw the son of Jesse coming to Nob, to Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub. So here he is, he's dobbing them in. And he inquired of Yahweh for him and gave him victuals, which is the showbread, and gave him the sword of Goliath, the Philistine. Now, we haven't got to that part of chapter 21 yet. We're coming back to there. That's a very important part, by the way, in the theme of our exhort this morning. But I don't recall reading in chapter 21 that Ahimelech had done anything on behalf of David in terms of praying. Okay, but Doeg here is saying he inquired of Yahweh for him. Again, that's a lie. It's a lie. It didn't happen. Well, at least it's not recorded. So if it did happen, it wasn't recorded. But from the surface reading, it seems he never actually made inquiry of Yahweh for David. So that's a lie on his behalf, Doeg's behalf. Then the king sent to call Ahimelech, and so through to verse, I suppose, 13 here, Saul is doing that. He's inquiring, why didn't you tell me what was going on? You know, and now you've given, David bread and a sword, and you've made inquiry to God for him. Why, why would you do that? He would rise up against me, it says. So Saul's very upset with Ahimelech. Well, Ahimelech, rightly so, says to the king, and he speaks truth, who is so faithful among all the servants of David, as David, which is the king's son-in-law? Why would Ahimelech have cause to be concerned or worried that David's approach to him was all about, as far as Saul was concerned, treason? He would have no reason to believe that or know that. So I think he was obviously speaking truth here. And he continues on, which is the king's son-in-law, and goeth at thy bidding and is honourable in thine house. Did I then begin to inquire of God for him? Oh, no, he hadn't. Be it far from me. Let not the king. So there's the point, right? Doeg said he'd made inquiry, but here Ahimelech saying, I didn't make inquiry. So there's the answer to that question. Be it far from me. Let not the king impute anything unto his servant, nor to all the house of my father, for thy servant knew nothing of all of this, less or more. And the king said, Thou shalt surely die, Ahimelech, thou and all thy father's house. And so over the next few verses, Saul instructs his soldiers to go and kill all the priests, and they refuse. And so who does he turn to? But in verse 18, Doeg. So Doeg the Edomite turned, and he fell upon the priests and slew on that day 85 persons. So of the priests, 85 people put to death. But it didn't stop there. And Nob, the city of the priests, smote he with the edge of the sword, both men and women, children and sucklings and oxen and asses and sheep with the edge of the sword. So that doesn't make you feel, I don't know, for me, that gets the emotion going a little bit. You think of that, 85 priests, multiply that by maybe 3 or 4 for all of the families, and then all of the livestock and everything else on top of that. That's a fair bit to take in, isn't it? And this is the ramifications of a choice that David's made. And how do we know that? Well, because it says in verse 20, and one of the sons of Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub, named Abiathar, escaped and fled after David. And Abiathar showed David that Saul had slain the Lord's priests, Yahweh's priests. And David said unto Abiathar, I knew it that day when Doeg the Edomite was there, that he would surely tell Saul, I have occasioned the death of all the persons of thy father's house. Imagine that being on your conscience. 200 maybe, 300, who knows? Plus all the all the goods, all the possessions, all the livestock. How would you live with that on your conscience? Like, I find that incredible that that's sort of in use. But when you read the verse 22, it almost seems like the importance of that has been lost on David. It sort of says, yeah, I'm the one who occasioned the death, but you know what? Abide with me in verse 23. Fear not, for he that seeks your life seeks mine, but will keep you safe. And it almost seems like he's heard the news and moved on. But Psalm 56 shows us that he hasn't. So this has had a deep impact on David. So we're getting just a little bit more of the background here. It's all important. But that piece for me is, wow, that sort of gets the emotion going a little bit in me, and just imagining how I would feel if I was in David's place at that point, and knowing why, and that the reason for their deaths was me. Unintentional, yes. Didn't want that to happen, didn't go there with a plan for that to happen. But you know what? Collateral damage was that. And that for us, the lesson for us in that is the impact that a decision we make can actually have on others. So it is, and again, unintentional. You probably wouldn't see this sort of an impact typically these days, but in some countries, absolutely. It's still would be the same today, same sort of outcomes. And of course, we keep our brothers and sisters of those countries in our thoughts and prayers each day. So we come back. Where am I going? That's fine. So yes, we come back just to chapter 21, and we'll just finish off this bit of context. Okay, so with all that in mind, we get to verse 8. And David said unto Ahimelech, is there not here under thine hand spear or sword? For I have neither brought my sword nor my weapons with me, because the king's the king's business required haste. I had to get going a bit quickly. I didn't have time to pick up my weapons and my sword. You know what's interesting about that? It's likely lie number 2. So lies beget lies, as the phrase goes. That's lie number 2, because in Israel there were 2 swords, and Jonathan and Saul were the only ones who had swords. No one else did at this point in time. So again, that's not quite the truth that David's saying here. Sure, he would have had weapons. He had a sling. We know that from earlier stories. But again, he sort of reiterates. He doubles down is maybe the term there on the lie that he started with about being on the king's business as well. Well, then in verse 9, we have here, and the priest said, well, the sword of Goliath, the Philistine, whom thou slewest in the valley of Elah, behold, it is here wrapped in a cloth behind the ephod. If thou wilt take that, take it, for there is no other save that here. David said, there is none like that. Give it me. It's none like that sort of Goliath, the giant of flesh. Give it to me. Give me that sword. That's what I need. And so at this point, you can see there's an option, an opportunity. Ahimelech is actually giving David to make a decision here. You see, he says, if thou wilt take that, take it. If thou wilt. You sure you want to take this, David? Is this the course of action that you want to take from here? And in the situation, absolutely. There's no sword like that one. Jonathan and Saul's swords, they're all right, maybe, but the sword of Goliath is not a sword that's like that one. Give it me. Okay, so now we've taken the showbread, and now we're taking the sword of a fleshly giant, because that's going to help save me. So the decision's made in David's mind. He's going it alone. This is in his own strength. He's going to work out his own salvation. And of course, there's foolishness in that, and he soon comes to realize that. And we'll get to the culmination of those thoughts shortly in Psalm 56. But said before, there's no wasted words in the word of God. So you notice there where it says, behold, it was wrapped in a cloth behind the ephod. It's not just for information's sake. This is actually the most important little phrase in this chapter in terms of this theme of trust and where we're going to place our trust. Just turn over very quickly to chapter 30 of 1 Samuel. 1 Samuel 30. And just in the context here, this is, of course, a little later on, and David's been off fighting, and he comes back, and in the start of chapter 30 here, the Amalekites had invaded the south, and Ziklag, the city that David was living in with all his family and all the men and their families with him, that had been smitten and burned with fire, and they'd taken the women captives that were therein. They slew not any, so they hadn't killed any, thankfully, either great or small, but they carried them away and went on their way. So David and his men, they returned to the city in verse 3, and behold, it's burned with fire. Everything they have is gone. And of course, in verse 4, as you'd understand, they lift up their voice and wept until there was no more power to weep. You think of that. You've wrung yourself dry of tears. There is no more. And David's two wives were captives, Ahinoam, the Jezreelitess, and Abigail, the wife of Nabal the Carmelite. And David was greatly distressed for the people spake of stoning him, because of the soul of all the people was grieved, every man for his sons and for his daughters. But David, okay, here's another point of decision, isn't it? David encouraged himself in the Lord his God. It's different to reaching over the ephod for a sword. And David said to Abiathar the priest, so the one who had fled to him, Ahimelech's son, if we hadn't got the point, there it is again. I pray thee, bring me hither the ephod. Not the sword of Goliath this time. This is the sword of the Lord. This is bring forth the ephod. Why? Abiathar brought thither the ephod to David, and David inquired at Yahweh, saying, shall I pursue after this troop? Shall I overtake them? And he answered him, pursue, but thou shalt surely overtake them, and without fail recover all. What might have changed, brothers and sisters, if David had have chosen the ephod instead of the sword? What might have changed? Well, I tell you what has changed. David's response in a time of decision. Here's another time of great trial. Here, his life's under threat. They're going to stone him. But his response is different. And so the ephod is brought forth, and David doesn't make that same mistake a second time. Okay, well, with those things in mind, brothers and sisters, that is the context. That is a mindset, perhaps, that we come into in Psalm 56. And we'll just take a few of the verses from Psalm 56 to see how this theme of trust, making a decision in whom we should trust and place our trust, is carried out through the words of this psalm. So let's have a look at Psalm 56, just as we bring our thoughts to a close and as we approach the emblems on the table. So in Psalm 56, David, as we know, all that background, he's fled. He's got the sword of Goliath. He's come in the midst of the Philistines, what happened amongst the Philistines? Well, not so long ago, he defeated their champion, cut off his head with that sword, same sword, and defeated the Philistine armies. And so here he is now coming back amongst them with that same sword. There's a certain irony in all of that, isn't there? However, that's the point, and that's the outcome of making the decision to try to go it alone and try to do things in our own strength, because we think we can control what we're doing in our lives, or we can control what our destiny is going to be, until we realize we can't. And here we see this in the background and in this psalm. No, instead, what is the advice that is given here? Well, I think, brothers and sisters, when we have a look at, there's a couple of verses or couplets of verses, sorry, is the word I'm trying to use here. And we see these in verse 3 and 4 and 10 and 11. So there's repeated phrasing here, but it tells us what the theme is. What time, says David, I am afraid. And you think of it, he's now in front of the king in Gath, and he's faking to be mad. He's feigning himself mad at this point. Again, it's a lie. Again, it's a fabrication, and he's doing it to save his life. And you think, how many chances do we need? But that just shows how gracious God is. He's not a man. God is not a man that would, well, as he says, that the sons of Jacob would be consumed. He sees no iniquity in Jacob. And you think, how's that possible? How can God look upon the actions of Israel in the wilderness and say he doesn't find any sin in them? That's a God with a different perspective to us. That's not a human-made God. That is the true and living God. And we're so thankful for that, because he doesn't give up after one or two mistakes. It's about a process of development throughout life. So this is an amazing sort of little period of time that David has sunk to the lowest of the low points, to have to fake that you're out of your mind in order to save your life. That's probably the lowest ebb that David got to at this stage in his life. But he was at point for change, decision, and it was almost handed to him. It's so interesting that David is there. They all know that he is the David who slew Goliath. And yet Achish says, what do you got this madman in my house for? He's faking. He's faking madness. Get him out of here. So actually, although David was faking, Achish could see straight through the pretense. Anyway, the point is, that's where he is, and David thinks his day's just about done. But at that point in time, what time I'm afraid? I will trust in thee. In God, I will praise his word. In God, I have put my trust. I will not fear what flesh can do unto me. And that's the point he had to get to understand that he was in fear and he was fleeing because of what flesh could do to him. That's not what he should have been afraid of. That's not what we should be afraid of. As the New Testament brings out for us, should fear the living God. That's who we should fear. And not in the sense of fear what he could do to us, put us in the grave eternally, but fear him, reverence him, and that won't be the outcome. And that's the point. So if we put our trust in God, so we can see this theme of trust. And again, he bookends, if you like, the psalm with the same thought. So in verse 10 and 11, in God I will praise his word. In the Lord will I praise his word. In God have I put my trust. I will not be afraid what man can do unto me. Not be afraid. So if we were in any doubt, I think we can see that this is really a psalm that's expressing David's understanding that it was trust. It was trust that got him into this problem, but it's trust in God that will get him out, not his own strength. Trust in God. So in that situation, as we know, he's in great fear, and fear is not a nice feeling. Not a nice feeling, but fear is something that God allows us to experience. And the reason for it is because it develops trust, it develops faith, it develops character. And that's what God is looking for from us, obviously, is molded and shaped characters that we might show forth his character and his glory. So fear in its own right helps us to get, in particularly in David's situation here, to get to that point where he knows he can't protect himself. Only God can protect and preserve him. And that's such a key thing. Like it's learn to let go and let God work. Such a key thing, isn't it, in our lives? It's so hard to do, to be honest. We like to make decisions and feel like we're in charge of what our destiny is going to be. But being part of God's kingdom means letting go of that, what is instinctual, and putting trust and faith in God. It's a simple theme, isn't it? But it's a question and a thing that we're tested with every day. decisions in life. So it's able, of course, to form that conviction in ourselves as well. God really does know what's best for us, not only now, not only in this situation, not only in today as we are, but eternally. God has the answers. God has the right way. So David says twice, I will not fear what man or flesh can do to me. He realizes flesh is like grass. It's withering, it's fading. What can flesh do to him from an eternal perspective? Yes, it can put him in the grave right now, but that's the worst it could do. It couldn't stop God bringing him out of the grave. And that's the difference. There's a difference now in the perspective. And I think that is picked up in the latter part of the psalm here in particular. I will not fear, says David. And in the Hebrew, the meaning, the sense behind it is I cannot fear. I cannot fear what flesh can do to me, because flesh is withering and dying. And though it might put me in the grave, it cannot stop God bringing me out of the grave for that eternal future. So David's really, changed in his demeanor here, his thoughts. God hasn't delivered him out of that situation yet. He's still in the middle of it. This psalm is recording his thoughts when he's before the king in Gath. So he hasn't been delivered, and he doesn't know that there's any guarantees that he will be, but he's sure that he will be ultimately. And that's an eternal perspective. It's not here and now, it's living for that future time. So his focus had shifted, and it was now in a correct position. As I said, I wanted to just very quickly touch on verses 6 to 8 here, because in the middle of those two sections there about trusting in God, we have these words. Every day they wrest my words. They're wrestling with them. They're trying to make me sound like I'm saying things that I haven't actually said. They're putting words in my mouth. I will not fear what flesh can do unto me. Every day they wrest my words. All their thoughts are evil against me. Against me for evil. They gather themselves together. They hide themselves. They mark my steps when they wait for my soul. So you think of that. And I'm sure in David's mind, he's thinking back to Doeg. Because Doeg was there, and Doeg marked David's steps, and Doeg was the one who gave the report of everything that went on and made up a little bit of stuff along the way as well, just to embellish it. Okay. And I feel David has Doeg in mind. Yes. Saul would also be there. He's seeking his life. Albeit the one thing that I think makes a difference there is David's attitude towards Saul. And at the death of Saul, he says he was lovely. Lovely and all this stuff. And you think, how can he come up with that? That's not the Saul that's being described here. But David's view of Saul was that. But in this case, he's talking about those who are thinking about evil of him. And I do think there's a reference there to Doeg. Shall they escape by iniquity? In thine anger, cast down the people, O God. David's now changed. It's not David executing justice and judgment. It's David asking for God to judge and to show his justice in that case, because David knows that he's not right. And we know that we're not right. We have to rely on God for his judgment and justice. And then verse 8, thou tellest my wanderings. Put thou my tears into thy bottle. Are they not in thy book? I think the NIV, Mike, had it as count my tears or write down my tears in your book. I think it was that you put it there. But I love the King James sort of little picture there, because, you don't just have anyone wipe away tears from your eyes. You don't allow just anyone to do that. But those who are the absolute closest to you, you'd allow that to happen. And I think that just expresses just how close David's relationship to God is. He had fallen away, but now he knows where he has to be. And so his relationship is returning to being at one with God. The Bible describes David as the man after God's own heart. And here he is, pretty typical of all of us. trying to walk a path towards the kingdom, but our path tends to go like this along the road, to the right hand and to the left. But that's the point, isn't it? Falling not to the right hand and to the left. We press towards that mark of the kingdom. There's a bit more in that, of course, with right hand and lefts in the biblical context. But I always sort of well up a little bit myself with tears when I think about that. God capturing the tears in the bottle, storing those up. They're not forgotten. God's not a God who's, like a God of man who'll be like, was it Sisyphus or whatever the old Greek fables about Sisyphus who's, is it Sisyphus who's condemned to rolling a boulder uphill for all eternity? That's man's gods. That's man's justice. There's no mercy in that. It's just about execution of power, but not our God. And it's the same God David worshipped, is the same God that we worship, who counts our tears and wants that same closeness of relationship. While we're sort of just thinking about that, one last place to turn to is Revelation 21. Because I think, brothers and sisters, in that context, how can you not turn to here? Because though David's words of Psalm 56 are perhaps a personal example to him, and of course we take from that lessons ourselves. Revelation 21 is speaking about the bride of Christ. And what does it say here? Verse 4, and God shall wipe away all tears from their eyes. And there will be no more death, neither sorrow nor crying, neither shall there be any more pain, for the former things are passed away. And what a beautiful vision that is. The former thing. No more death, no more sorrow, no more crying, no more pain. All of us have experienced those things. But this with all of the experiences of mortality, these things will be taken away. They will give way to a time of eternal life, righteousness, peace. What a great hope we have to look forward to. I find that so encouraging to see those words, to read them. It does us good to read them frequently, I feel. Okay, so just in conclusion, verse 13, I think, of Psalm 56 really shows, again, that shift in David's thinking. Verse 13, for thou hast delivered my soul from death. Wilt thou deliver my feet from falling, that I may walk before God in the light of the living? Life isn't over yet for David. There is still experiences to come. There are still decisions to be made. Still going to be faced with troubles. So the second half of the verse, I feel, is pointing to the fact that from now on, God, help my feet to walk in the right paths, as he says, in the light of the living. That's where David wants to be. That's the exhortation for us as well. Making that decision, choosing to walk in God's ways, put our trust, put our faith in God, put our confidence in God. And I think the thing to pick up there is the fact that David says, for thou hast delivered my soul from death. Well, yes, he has. He's not out of the situation yet. And the point David's making is, and I think, Mike, can you just read that from the NIV again? For thou hast delivered my soul from death, the first part. I thought I'd actually put it really beautifully. The first part of it.
We delivered me from death, and my feet are stumbled. Like walk of God in the light of life.
Yeah. So notice the tense that's used there. You have delivered me. No, he hasn't. He's still in front of the king in Gath here. No, you have delivered me. And that's a change in mindset. That's a David who's now trusting in God implicitly. So brothers and sisters, what greater way could God show to us that we can trust in him for salvation than giving the only perfect man who has ever lived, to die upon a cross for our salvation. And we may not find ourselves in situations quite the same as David was here, but nevertheless, we do find ourselves with real issues in challenging times. And the weapons that the world uses these days may not be, physical weapons, but perhaps the things that it knows that flesh really desires. So everything put before us caters to fulfillment of and service of self. Of course, God asked us to leave all of that behind and let God work in our lives. So let's, in the week ahead, take David's example. Let's follow after that and put our faith and our trust in God, because he is able to bring to pass all that he has promised. Thanks.